All right, I've made a few changes to this code. So here in the main function, we call a function called doWork. In this function, we call another function called createRectangle. And in this function, we create a rectangle with a negative width. Now let me show you something. I'm going to put a breakpoint on this line and run the program in debug mode. We can click on this icon or press Ctrl and D. Now here in the debugger panel, you can see the list of functions called up to this point in reverse order. So currently we are in the createRectangle function. Previously we were in the doWork function, and before that we were in the main function. Now what you see here is called the call stack. It shows our function calls in the reverse order. Okay? Now, back to the createRectangle function. So this line throws an exception. Now at this time, the runtime looks for a catch block in this function. Currently we don't have a catch block, so the exception is unhandled and control moves outside of this function and goes to the previous function. So if you have any code here, this line is not going to get executed, okay? So the runtime goes to the call stack and removes the current function from the top of the stack. Now the control moves to this function. Again, the runtime looks for a catch block. Currently we don't have one. So one more time, the control moves outside of this function and goes to the main function. And one more time, the runtime looks for a catch block. There is none here. So by default, the runtime terminates our program, okay? The question that often comes up is, where should we catch an exception? So technically we can catch that exception in any of these functions, but where is the right place? Well, there is no right answer here. It really depends on our application and what we are building. For example, one way is to catch this exception in this function. So if the user enters a negative value for the width, perhaps we can use a default value like 0 or 1, whatever that makes sense. Then we let our program continue its execution. So the doWork function will not be aware of something that happened in the createRectangle function. So we let this function handle the exception locally. But sometimes this is not the right solution. We want the exception to be propagated to another function up in the call stack. Now, a common technique that we use is, in the main function, we wrap the entire code in the try-catch block. So if any exception happens anywhere in this program, we'll catch that exception and show an error to the user. This is better than letting our program crash. So here we're going to catch all kinds of exceptions. So as the parameter, we should use the exception class, because this is the base class for all exceptions, right? And just like before, we want to make this a constant reference parameter. So here we can print the error message on the console. But in a real application, quite often, we want to log these exceptions somewhere in a file or in a database. So later on, we can look at our log file and see what exceptions or what errors happened when our program was ready.